Tiny Leaders Reborn is home to a lot of classic decks from other formats, adapted into tiny form. From Boomer Jund to Legacy Lands to even Stifledon, TLR has a whole host of iconic archetypes that you can play. It even has Mississippi River. Wait, why is Grist here? Hi, I'm the Cosmerian, and today we'll be talking about one of my favorite decks in all Tiny Leaders. It's a deck that has become quite infamous in the community, and it has recently gotten second place in one of our online tournaments. For the uninitiated, here's what the deck looks like in action.
Well, I guess I could, but... Holy bugs. What the fuck?
Just a few bugs.
What the fuck? Oh my god. What the hell is that? What
Just
the
a casual
hell?
10 insects.
No, I lost. What the hell?
Just a few.
Man, like, I literally just lose.
And it all hinges on its deck's commander, Grist the Hunger Tide. Grist the Hunger Tide is a 3-mana Golgari Planeswalker with 3 loyalty and 3 abilities. For its +1 ability, it mills until it hits a non-insect card, and then adds 1 loyalty and 1 insect for each card milled this way. The -2 can sacrifice a creature to destroy a creature or Planeswalker, and the -5 can make your opponent lose life equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. In an average Grist deck, the commander fulfills the role of generating creatures and killing your opponent's creatures, and is typically a mid-range Aristocrats deck. However, in this deck, Grist has a singular purpose: to win the game. The thought process is this: if you can flip enough insects off of Grist's uptick, say 10, you can present a 1-turn kill with a horde of bugs and a gigantic ultimate. And even if they get rid of one of those threats, they would still die in 2 turns from the other. And so, the challenge becomes how to get as many hits with Grist's uptick as possible. The answer? Just have 2 types of cards: insects and lands. In TLR, a reasonable amount of lands is somewhere between 16 and 19. If you're a control deck, 18 or 19 serves you well, and if you're a faster deck like aggro, you can usually get away with 17 or even 16 lands. My Grist deck is running 10 lands and 39 insects in the main board. What's the method to my madness? Math. When making this deck, I wanted to get as few lands as possible. To do that, the first step was to play as many of the lands that can produce 2 colored mana as possible. In green and black, that meant 2 depletion lands, 2 sack lands, and 1 bounce land. Step 2 was to pull out the hypergeometric calculator. Realistically, the deck only needs 2 lands to function. Given the goal of the deck is to cast Grist and win, a normal land and one of the double mana lands is all I need to get there, even getting Grist down as early as turn 2. And because all I need is 2 lands, and the rest of my cards are mostly there to be insects, the deck can afford to mulligan down to 2. In many a competitive deck, mulling to 4 is a death sentence, but not this one. For the purposes of the hypergeometric calculator, that means I have 6 separate chances to see a hand of at least 2 lands. And with 10 lands in a 49-card deck, each hand has a 44% chance to have what I need. Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification of the math. If I draw 2 normal lands, that hand wouldn't be keepable, so there's a little wiggle room there. Through various testings, 10 has felt right. 9 is a bit too unwieldy, and 11 makes the chances of scoring big even less likely. And plus, who doesn't like a good round number? Well, that's the explanation of the lands out of the way. What about the other 39 cards? As previously stated, the most important part of these 39 cards are their type line. All 39 of them are either insects or changelings. The rest of the text barely matters. However, with 112 legal insects to choose from, and 16 changelings, we might as well pick the best of them. However, not all of the typically best insects are actually good in this deck. Cards like Springheart Nantuko and Scoot Mob are usually quite good, but with the number of lands that we're running, they're not all that useful. That said, there are still plenty of solid bugs, so here's the list. These are probably the 6 most important bugs in the deck. As you can probably imagine, cards like Pithing Needle or Disruptor Flute are pretty good at shutting down the deck's entire game plan. Luckily, God gave us answers. As of right now, the deck is running every single insect that can destroy an artifact, of which there are currently 6. Technically, there's a 7th, which is in the deck. But there is only 1 insect, which is also in the deck, that can flip our sweet baby Grist. But for all intents and purposes, there's 6. This means that despite being the weakest to getting needled, Grist is actually quite good at getting rid of them. There are also a few non-artifact removal insects, but these are much less important. Shout out to Nameless Inversion, as being probably the single strongest insect in the list, though. That's a legitimately good card right there. There's also Hex Parasite, which is a nifty way to kill planeswalkers. Another very important type of insect are mana dorks. These guys help recast Grist if our opponent has removal for our best girl. The notable one here is Molt's Tender, as he is DRS at home, but also a bug, so we love him. I'm also including Halo Scarab and Seed Chip Explorer here, as while they're not really a mana dork in the regular sense, they still serve the purpose of giving a temporary boost of mana to help recast Grist. Or in the Seed Chip's case, a way to cheat out Grist instead of having to pay 7 for her. However, mana dorks aren't the only bugs that can help recast the Bug Mother. These 4 brave soldiers serve a dual purpose. They can both get us lands to help recast Grist, but also reduce the amount of misses in the deck. While there are only 2 basics in the main board, that is still generally enough so that these creatures will do something when they're cast. They also become more relevant post-board, but we'll get to that in a bit. Special shout out to Loam Larva, who is the cheapest of the 4, and one of the few ways I can feel comfortable keeping a 2-land hand that only has boring normal lands. The third main type of insect is the Flyers. While these guys don't actually do anything particularly unique for the deck, they do serve the valuable purpose of pushing in the last bit of damage. It's pretty reasonable to expect that Grist will win by itself a good portion of the time, but sometimes a bit of chip damage is needed to get the job done, and that's where these guys come in. There are a handful of other bugs that fill this role, but they have other special purposes that we'll get to later. And no, there are no Bolas Planeswalkers in the deck, and in Tiny Leaders in general. Turns out a 2-mana 2/1 flyer is good enough on its own. And now we're getting into the smaller categories. These are more filler cards, but they are far from useless. These 3 insects, while potentially working as ways to kill your opponent dead in very special cases, are mostly here to sacrifice all of your bugs to add a little bit of extra damage to Grist's ultimate. While it doesn't matter often, I have had plenty of games where those extra 2 or 3 creatures in the yard really made a difference. Speaking of cards in the grave, the deck also has a little bit of grave hate. Turns out in format with Titans, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of grave hate in your deck. While it's not super useful, the deck has a few cheap Death Touchers in there as chump blockers when needed. They don't do much, but they are cheap. Conversely, there are also a handful of bugs that are incredibly useful, in very specific matchups. One of the best ways to stop Grist from doing all that nonsense that Grist does is to stop her from even resolving. While the sideboard plan is mostly focused on answering this issue, there are a few bugs which are worth putting in the main board that can help us with these things. The deck does have Cavernous Souls, which is the best way to keep Grist from getting countered, but some more redundancy main board doesn't hurt. We also have Skylasher here, just because I hate blue. And a Flash 3 is also quite relevant, but mostly to hate on blue. And now for the last 3. These guys don't really fit in any category, but they are nice to have. Realmwalker helps dig for artifacts removers if I need to free the tide, and also helps to tell me if there's a land on top. Lawbringer does a similar thing, but trades proper digging for a bit of filling the yard and a big body. And 3-Tree Mascot is mostly there for getting mooned, and sometimes to fix my mana. Well, if you made it this far, I commend you. You now have a pretty good idea of how the deck works, and hopefully have found a new appreciation for how much you can do with just insects. But now comes the most important part, sideboarding. This is the sideboard for the deck. As you may have noticed, this sideboard has 6 lands in it, which is 6 more lands than most decks have in their sideboards. And no, these aren't just filler cards. They actually serve a very important purpose. Oops All Bugs is a deck with one goal in mind, to cast Grist and then win. However, if you're playing against a control deck where they have a multitude of answers for Grist and not a lot of pressure, it's more important to recast Grist than it is to make a ton of bugs. And so, the sideboard comes in. Usually, I like to sideboard in all 6 lands, taking out 2 depletion lands and 1 of the sack lands. While I usually need 3 lands to cast Grist, I'm still much more likely to recast Grist, as only 1 of my lands sacrifices itself to make mana, and only if I need it to. However, this is not a hard and fast rule. Against some decks, it's important to get a fast start, so I only add the 3 basics, but keep in all of the 2 mana lands. This is also something that I do against decks that run multiple Blood Moon effects, as those really screw the deck over. And against decks that have next to no pressure, where their win con is boring you to death, sometimes it's worth going up to 16 lands instead of 13. Now, is there any particular reason for 13 lands? Full transparency, not really. The hypergeometric calculator is much less useful in this case, as there's just too many variables to account for. So if you're playing the deck, feel free to play around a bit and determine what feels nice to you. As for the 4 non-land cards in the sideboard, these are unfortunately not bugs. If they were, they would be in the main board. These cards are selectively boarded in depending on the type of control deck. Against a deck with high counterspells, bringing in just the anti-counter cards are needed. Against a deck with heavy removal, especially black removal, sliding in the protection pieces can be useful. But against non-control decks, the sideboard is largely irrelevant. Grist Bugs is a very powerful deck, not just because of its explosive capabilities, but also because it attacks at a very special angle. To properly counter it, you usually need to both remove Grist and wipe the board, both of which are hard asks on their own. Additionally, most of the methods of countering combo decks are just much less useful against Grist, who can just ignore them. And while not a gameplay strength, one of the big advantages of Grist is that it is cheap. If you're playing in paper and you're in an event that doesn't allow proxies, this deck is great at being inexpensive, as the majority of the deck is just random insects. Replacing the bio in the deck with an overgrown tomb already nukes the price. And if you want to go even cheaper, I've created a budget version of the deck that makes a few small tweaks to the deck to make the deck even less expensive. Of course, if you already have a small competitive collection, that price goes down even lower. So if the only thing stopping you from bugging out is the price tag, you have nothing to worry about. Playing against Grist often boils down into a statistics game. Does your deck have more answers to Grist than the amount of times that Grist can be realistically cast? If yes, then you're favored. However, Grist is also an incredibly variance-based deck. For every insane run of insects, there's a sad land off the top, or a meager 1 or 2 insects. Depending on how lucky your uptakes are, can often determine whether you win or lose a game. There are just things that deck construction can't account for. However, there are some cards that are really good against Grist. The aforementioned Pithing Needle effects, while the deck is built to be able to handle them, are pretty good at killing a mold of 3 or 2, as if the deck can't remove the needle, it's almost certain to lose. In a similar vein, counterspells are also a pain in Grist's wiggly side, as mentioned previously. Blood Moon effects can be quite strong, but they're often less powerful than you'd imagine. These effects are all 3 mana, which means that even on the play, Grist is probably going to be cast before the moon hits the field. But if your opponents can speed it out, then Grist is often dead in the water. Meathook Massacre in particular is also really nasty. It's not just a board wipe, but also a huge source of life, making it much harder to win through just Grist ults. The biggest card that shuts down the silly bug deck is Drainage Magistrate. As of now, there is only one card in the entire deck that can remove it. It's not an artifact or enchantment, and it's too big to be hit by Blister Beetle. While it needs to be played before Grist hits the field, it's a nearly guaranteed way to beat the deck. As for types of decks that Grist struggles against, there are 3 main deck archetypes that Grist has a hard time beating. The first of which has already been extensively discussed, is Control. Soul Sisters, it turns out, is surprisingly difficult to beat. When every Soul Warden negates a good portion of Grist's uptick, things get tricky. Though it's possible to deal 40 damage with a horde of bugs, it's much harder than 20. The most interesting tough matchup, however, is other combo decks. Decks like Ral or Food Chain, who can win all in one turn, can quite often win out of nowhere, with very little care as to the imminent threat of a swarm of critters. And often these decks have other ways to stall an extra turn or two, which is often all they need to combo off. Not even the side plan, of chumping with a bunch of bugs, matters much when your opponent can just deal infinite damage to your dome or mill you out. I suppose in a similar vein, mill decks would be pretty bad. Thank you very much for listening to my deep dive into the world of bugs. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I do apologize that this was a bit of a long one, but it is admittedly quite the strange deck. Hopefully this has inspired you to check out the deck, or at least gain a new fear when playing TLR. Let me know what you thought of this video, and as always, stay tiny.